out in the lands of danger and flame. Heroes of legend are making their name. Swords and spells with hearts full of zest, they ride with pride on a quest of interest. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Mystic lands and monsters to face, they're saving the world at a breakneck pace. From the Verdant province to Dragon's Lair, wicked wizards and trolls beware. With the rogue a knight and a mage so wise, they'll outwit danger and claim the prize. Legends told round campfire flames of secret spells and forgotten names. A hidden power, an ancient key, the fate of the realm is their destiny. Heckfire Club, riding through the night. Heckfire Club, standing for what's right. Curses, traps, and mysteries deep, no dragon's hoard is out of reach. They laugh at danger, they don't play it safe. Each wild adventure's a tale of interest, a caress. Heckfire Club, tales of interest.
What began as an effort to restore order quickly spiraled into chaos. The Merchants' Council in the province of Verdun had reinstated the long-contested guild contracts, opening the floodgates for adventurers and mercenaries to fill the vacuum left by an overburdened provincial guard. The guilds grew unchecked, taxation and tariffs became extortion, and cities that once thrived on open trade turned inward, fractured by distrust and rising tensions. Rumours of economic sanctions, territorial disputes and banditry spread like wildfire, while frost gripped once lush fields and storms battered the countryside, mirroring the unrest of the people. Adventuring in Verdun was a dangerous business, taken up by few and often costly. The promises of riches and treasures had oft proven ruinous to those who bought into imagined lore and local tall tales. Life on the road and in the wilds was not for the faint of heart. Amid the turmoil, the Tinborough mining, smithing and stoneworks guilds had announced a staggering reward. 5,000 gold pieces to uncover and eliminate the threat preying on workers building a vital trade road between their city and Tannertown. For Zirath, a towering dragonkin paladin, and his companions, Frizz, a sharp-witted human wizard, Thalia, a shadowy tabaxi warlock, Thomas, the silver-tongued con artist, and Zora, a battle-scarred half-elf barbarian, the offer was impossible to ignore. The long road spent travelling to Tinborough was not their first journey, nor their first taste of danger. Together, they had unravelled mysteries, both mundane and arcane. They had stood against the soul-render in the cursed von Eldrick ruin, pulled a young girl from the clutches of death, and destroyed a relic of unspeakable evil. In Bridgerton, they had played a dangerous game, uncovering a cache of stolen weapons from beneath the city's Grand Bridge, and in the shadowed marshlands of the west they hunted a monstrous swamp king known as the Brutelock, all the while fending off automatons from the twisted mind of Karzak the Artificer. Their deeds had brought them some renown among the smaller towns, but Verdun was crumbling faster than they could steady it. Now, amid whispers of ancient forces stirring in forgotten places, the adventurers found themselves chasing not just gold but answers. Each step forward brought them closer to the heart of the province's unravelling fate, and each choice weighed heavier as the bonds holding the province together frayed. Their path to Tinborough had been fraught with unsettling omens. Sudden frosts had bitten at their skin under summer skies, and twisters had formed and dissipated with unnatural precision, as if the very elements had been testing their resolve. Frizz jotted down theories in her precious journal, her mind working tirelessly to make sense of the unnatural weather patterns. Thalia had prowled ahead, her sharp eyes scanning the terrain for signs of arcane tampering, her every movement calculated and precise. Zirath's stoic calm had steadied the group, his silent determination a constant reassurance in the face of growing uncertainty. It wasn't purposeful on his part, but it nonetheless had that effect on his companions. Yet beneath their collective resolve, unease had simmered, an unspoken tension, a feeling that they were heading towards something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. The signs had been everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the province, a land unravelling thread by thread. Zora was well travelled in the province. His company knew he had good friends in the city where they now headed. When they had finally crested the last hill, Tinborough had come into view, a sprawling city that stood as both a beacon of industry and a bastion of resilience against the untamed north. Nestled between towering mountain ranges, it was one of the largest and the northernmost cities in the Verdun province, its stone walls rising defiantly against the encroaching wilderness. The Great Forge, the name given to Tinborough's master guildhall, dominated the skyline, its colossal chimneys belching smoke into the sky where it mingled with the mist rolling down from the peaks. The buildings were carved marble and expertly fitted, stone harvested from abundant quarries in the surrounding cliffs, their roofs fortified against the harsh winds that swept through the valley. The city was the beating heart of Verdun's mining and smithing, producing the province's dragon's share of the finest brick, stone, steel, weapons, armour and gems. Any blade that cut true, any shield that withstood the mightiest blow, and any chainmail that saved its wearer in battle likely owed its origins to this city. The mines carved deep into the surrounding mountains yielded precious metals and rare gemstones, feeding the forges that never ceased their relentless work. The flowing lava underneath the mountains had been harnessed to power its forges. Masters of their craft guarded their techniques jealously, each smithing house passing down its own closely held secrets through generations. Tinborough's influence stretched far beyond its walls. The adventurers had found more than tension and weariness in Tinborough. They had found camaraderie. The newly formed and thriving mining cooperative welcomed them warmly, offering a night of hearty company and far too much ale and spiced spirits. The rough-and-tumble miners, hardened by years of dangerous work in the mountains, had embraced the adventurers like kindred spirits. Laughter had echoed through the stout stone hall as the group shared stories of their adventures. The miners, in turn, recounted their own tales of peril, rock slides, cave-ins, and the eerie sounds that sometimes whispered from the depths of the mines. Zirath, ever stoic, had surprised everyone by putting away round and round of fire gin. The night was not entirely joyous tales and recanting, however. The miners voiced their frustrations openly. Trade through Cedarcrest, the timber metropolis to the south, had been strangling them with tariffs, making it harder to sell their goods beyond the mountains. The new road the Guildhall had proposed, they insisted, was their lifeline, a chance to bypass Cedarcrest's chokehold and reach Tannertown and the south directly. Their determination to see it completed had been evident in every raised tankard and fervent word shared that night. At the end of the revelry, the members of the cooperative had raised glass and tankard in thanks to the adventurers. Better wages, better treatment, an equal share in halls. This had been possible thanks to a generous share of loot they had, to some grudgingly, shared with the miners in a past encounter. Enjoying their downtime, the adventurers had taken time to visit Boric Ironfist, one of Tinborough's most respected smiths. Boric had been at his forge as always, the steady clang of his hammer ringing out as they approached. The sight of him, broad-shouldered, weathered and unwavering, was familiar to Zora, who had known him for years. The news of their latest quest of Karzak the Artificer's defeat had made the smith pause mid-swing. He had studied them for a long moment, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. Then something singularly rare happened. Boric smiled, a slow, deliberate expression of approval that Zora had never seen before. He had set his hammer aside and motioned for them to sit by the forge. The bottle of spiced whiskey he produced had been dusty, as if saved for a special occasion. A family heirloom, it seemed to him fitting he share it. The powerful and ancient artificer was a lingering wound on his family's history. They had passed it around, Boric listening intently as the adventurers recounted the battle against Karzak, He had nodded along, his gaze never wavering from the fire, as if seeing the story unfold within the flames. There had been no need for many words. Borwick's steady presence had said more than enough. Before they left, Borwick had reached for a small wooden box, retrieving a Blademaster's whetstone. The item of great rarity had gleamed faintly in the firelight, its edges worn smooth from years of careful crafting. He had placed it in Zora's hands with a quiet explanation of its value, how it could sharpen steel of any blade to an edge that cut truer and deeper. The gift had carried a value beyond its size, a symbol of respect from one craftsman to another. The night with Borwick had been quieter than the rowdy gathering at the cooperative, but no less meaningful. There had been a sense of mutual understanding between them, a bond forged in resilience and shared hardship. Zora thought of his old friend Alistair. Vengeance for his death at the hands of Karzak was not as cathartic as he had thought. He missed him dearly. Zora drank to his memory, keeping silent. He, after all, lived to fight today because of him. The next morning, the adventurers had made their way to the Great Forge, where the northern guilds held their highest offices, heads aching from the night before. The towering structure, with its massive stone doors and ancient carvings of miners and smiths at work, had stood at the heart of Tinborough, like a sentinel of the city's legacy. Their walk through the wide thoroughfares had taken an unexpected turn when a boy's cry for help pierced the stillness. Turning down a narrow alley, they had come upon a troubling sight. 3 guards, rough and poorly outfitted, had surrounded a boy clutching a handful of coins, demanding more for his protection. The child had shrunk back against the wall, his wide eyes darting between the guards, searching for a way out. Thomas's sharp gaze tracked the guards. He had known a shakedown when he saw one. This wasn't a matter of enforcing law, but squeezing coin from those who had none to spare. It was evident these weren't the bravest and finest that City Guard could be. The paladin and barbarian advanced on the scene as the others looked on from the main street. Zirath had stepped forward, his draconic presence casting a commanding shadow down the alley, while Zora followed close behind, his imposing frame unmistakable. Neither had needed to speak. The guards had taken one look at their rather intimidating figures and scattered, their curses lost in the winding streets as they fled. The boy had remained frozen for a moment, clutching his tattered jacket. His words, when he finally spoke, had been edged with frustration and fear. The good guards, he had said, were gone. Most of them had left to chase lucrative guild contracts elsewhere, abandoning patrols and peacekeeping for better pay and promises of fortune. Those who had taken their place cared little for protecting the people, focused more on lining their pockets. They bid the boy stay on the larger thoroughfares and streets despite the added travel time. He nodded and continued wheeling his cart, weaving quickly through the crowds. They continued their walk toward the Great Forge. Outside the imposing guild hall, the party had come upon a chaotic scene. Merchants and guildsmen from across the province stood in tightly packed groups, their voices raised in heated arguments that echoed across the stone courtyard. Tanner Town traders, draped in fine leather cloaks, argued fiercely with Cedarcrest negotiators, who stood out in their forest green attire, while Tinborough's gilded elites, easily identified by their finely tailored coats and jewellery, looked down their noses at both. The air bristled with tension as accusations flew back and forth over tariffs, trade restrictions, and taxes that each faction claimed were unjust. The guild members and magistrates kept up their clamouring even as the party moved between them through the hall's main gate. They did not engage and only moved on. The construction of the Great Forge was a testament to Tinborough's craft. Grand pillars carved from dark granite, etched with intricate patterns, a mix of elven, dwarven, and all styles of the great masters of their craft. As they made their way toward the assembly hall, they passed displays of masterwork weapons and armour. Thomas noted them reflexively, but quickly regained focus. Inside the magistrate hall, quiet murmurs filled the chamber as a dozen adventurers waited on carved wooden benches. They were a hardened lot, men, women, dwarves, and half-elves alike, clad in armour and travel-worn gear marked with soot and dirt from their travels along the dangerous roads of the province. At the front of the room, 3 magistrates stood behind a sturdy wooden podium. 2 dwarves with grizzled faces and braided beards watched the gathered adventurers with solemn eyes, their expressions as unyielding as the steel they forged. The 3rd magistrate, a tall elven woman with silver-streaked hair, stepped forward. Her gaze was sharp, her presence commanding, and her robes, dark, trimmed with silver and iron, reflected the careful craftsmanship of Tinborough. She began to speak, her tone cutting through the murmurs like a hammer striking steel. The road project between Tinborough and Tanner Town had stopped, she explained. The road builders from the province's Works and Ways Guild had refused to continue after several crews disappeared in the Darkwood, their fates unknown. Something was hunting them, a relentless threat lurking in the shadows of the ancient forest. The guild could not afford to let the project fail. The new road would open critical trade routes and break Cedar Crest's stranglehold on goods passing through the province. They were to find whatever was hunting them and put an end to it, the vagueness of the language noted by all. Upon proof of completing the task, a sum of 5,000 gold pieces would be paid to the person or group responsible. The hefty sum, enough to live on and live well for years, spurred ongoing exchanges among the crowd. The newcomer to the hall silenced them quickly. The steel and iron doors of the guild hall had swung open with a groaning creak, drawing every eye to the figure who strode in with purpose. The tall man's silver and blue enamelled armour gleamed under the torchlight, each dent and scratch a testament to countless battles fought and survived. His face, weathered and stern, betrayed no emotion as he reached into a weathered leather bag slung over his shoulder. Without a word, he cast his burden to the floor, a severed wolf's head, twisted and monstrous in size. Its eyes, dull with death, stared lifelessly at the gathered adventurers. Grotesque fangs jutted from its maw, and the thick fur around its neck was matted with dried blood. The creature was unlike any ordinary wolf, its features warped by unnatural forces. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room as adventurers recoiled in horror. The man's voice, cold and clipped, cut through the noise. The monstrous wolves, he claimed, stalked the Darkwood, preying on the road crews who dared to push deeper into their shadows. The severed head, he said, was only a glimpse of what awaited those brave or foolish enough to enter the cursed forest. His words rang in the room like a hammer striking steel. There was, according to the hunter, an alpha, as in any pack that far outsized the smaller wolves. One would-be adventurer stood and quietly left, a portly man in his middle years. That was all the rest needed to unleash a rush to the door. Self-proclaimed adventurers scrambled from their seats, fear overtaking their earlier resolve. Their dreams of fortune dissolved as the reality of the danger set in. They shoved past one another in their haste to leave, boots clattering on the stone floor as the guild hall emptied. The scramble would serve as cover for some wishing to save face and make an exit without being noticed. When the dust settled, only 3 remained. A dagger-flipping rogue stood with casual ease, her dark hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. Confidence radiated from her every movement, and her striking beauty drew a momentary blush to Zora's rugged features before he quickly looked away. She caught his glance, offering a playful smirk, before returning her focus to the severed head on the floor. A retired guard from Central City, familiar and steady, remained seated. His calm presence drew a quiet smile from Thalia, though she said nothing. His gaze was sharp, watchful, and there was no mistaking the veteran's experience in dealing with danger. He was the same tall, and some in the party thought quite handsome, former sergeant the adventurers had crossed paths with at Stonebridge on the northern coast. And the man in silver and blue, the hunter, simply turned on his heel and left the hall without another word. His message had been delivered. The threat was real, and some less than full-hearted pretenders to the new guild contract had seen it firsthand. As dusk fell over the mountains surrounding the city, the inns and taverns filled with the echoes of clinking tankards gave way to the low murmur of frustrated workers and engineers. The party eavesdropped on whispered conversations, learning of the immense pressure weighing on Harken Bank. The financiers behind the road's construction were hemorrhaging funds as the project ground to a halt. They gathered supplies and lodged one final night before departing. When the sun rose, a familiar face from the Tinborough mining cooperative approached them at the inn, offering them a folded leather-bound map. The cooperative, it seemed, had acquired a detailed plan of the road project, complete with the planned route through the forest and marked work sites along the way. It was a gesture both of practicality and protection. The road had to be completed, and if anyone stood a chance of surviving the Darkwood, it would be those holding that map. Their friend was thankful it was in the hands of trusted friends. They accepted with gratitude. It contained everything the miners had gathered about the unexplored forest from local sources. The man had spoken of sheer cliffs that sliced through the landscape, razor-vine thickets that could tear through hardened leather, and hidden coves rumoured to lie deeper in the forest's reaches. His words had been cautious but earnest. This knowledge might save their lives. The adventurers left Tinborough through its eastern gates, where the stone roads gave way to soft woodlands. Pines and younger oaks dotted the landscape, their slender trunks rising from mossy ground, with wildflowers scattered at their roots. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the wind whispered softly through the branches. After some hours of walking, they found the start of the road, its rough path stretching eastward, lined by tall pines, standing like silent sentinels on both sides. They followed the section of road as far as it had been completed. Stone and timber stretched in neat, sturdy lines through the foothills, but it soon gave way to unfinished earth and wilderness. Everything beyond the last set of work markers felt wilder, less tamed by human hands. The trees grew closer together, their roots rising from the forest floor like the ribs of some ancient beast. They walked for days, their path winding deeper into the forest. The map they'd been given proved invaluable, with markers detailing planned routes and key search patterns. The search was methodical, each step leading them farther into the heart of the Darkwood, where the trees grew taller and the silence seemed to stretch just a little longer between the birdsongs. By twilight of the fourth day, the adventurers stumbled upon an abandoned cabin nestled in the thick of the Darkwood. The structure leaned heavily to one side, its crumbling timbers and sagging roof bearing the burden of centuries. Moss clung to the wooden walls, and ivy had claimed much of the exterior, winding through cracks and splitting planks. The air around the cabin felt different, still and hushed, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Exhausted from days of travel, the adventurers considered resting there for the night. The cabin, though weathered by time, offered shelter from the creeping shadows of the woods. Before settling in, they scouted the area, wary of any dangers that might lurk nearby. They found no tracks or signs of recent inhabitants, and the forest around the cabin seemed unnaturally quiet. It appeared safe enough, until Friz ventured behind the cabin. There, in the fading light, she was shocked to find 3 graves in a small clearing. The headstones were weathered and cracked, their carvings too faint to read. The mounds of earth had settled with age, suggesting the graves had been there for centuries. Yet each grave was adorned with fresh flowers, their vibrant petals standing out starkly against the dark soil. The sight sent a chill through the party. Whoever, or whatever, had placed the flowers was nowhere to be seen. Unease settled over the group as they returned to the cabin. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the remnants of a long-forgotten life lay scattered about. Near the hearth, Friz's sharp eyes caught the glint of something curious. She knelt and retrieved a small whistle carved in the shape of a wolf's head. The craftsmanship was intricate, with fine details etched into the whistle's wooden surface. She turned it over in her hands before slipping it into her pocket, her curiosity outweighing her caution. Upstairs they found signs that a family had once lived there. The second floor held 3 beds, 2 small and 1 large, each arranged neatly despite the passage of time. The blankets had long since decayed, and the remains of toys, a rusted lantern, and a cracked ceramic jug hinted at a quiet, ordinary life that had long since faded. The adventurers judged that it had been hundreds of years since anyone had lived there. It was then Thalia's eyes that caught a wooden carving tucked beneath a crumbling shelf. The figure, worn smooth by time, had resisted the decay that claimed the rest of the cabin. It depicted a crescent moon entwined with vines, its surface marked by deep, deliberate grooves. What stood out most was the material itself, old-growth oak, the kind found only in the heart of the Darkwood. Thalia handed it to Zora, and the two studied it carefully, noting its craftsmanship and the strange symbols etched into the wood. Despite their efforts, neither could determine its purpose or origin. Frustrated, they passed it to Friz, who examined it with growing intrigue. Her fingers traced the grooves, her eyes narrowing as recognition dawned. The patterns, she explained, were unmistakably druidic, symbols tied to the moon singers, an ancient and secretive circle of druids said to worship the moon and guard the balance of nature. The moon singers were more legend than fact, but their influence lingered in old tales among northern forests before the mountains. Whoever had once lived in the cabin had some connection to them, it seemed. A mystery that left the adventurers with more questions than answers. Still, the flowers on the graves lingered in their thoughts. Someone, or something, had been tending to this forgotten place. Whatever it was watching over the dead. The peaceful silence of the Darkwood shattered as monstrous howls pierced the night air. The sound, guttural and rage-filled, sent a chill down the adventurers' spines. They hadn't heard the beasts surrounding the cabin, and before they could react, the cabin's door splintered inward, and hulking wolven beasts crashed through the windows and walls. Their eyes glowed with black fury, their massive forms squeezing through the shattered openings with terrifying ease. Chaos erupted in the cramped cabin. Zirath reacted first, stepping forward with a roar, his arm raised to block the first lunging beast. The wolf slammed into him, its claws raking across his forearm, pushing him back toward the fireplace. He gritted his teeth and drove his axe upward, slicing deep into the creature's neck. But another wolf was already forcing its way through the broken window, eyes locked on him with murderous intent. Zora swung his sword in a wide arc, the blade catching one wolf across the jaw and sending it crashing into the table. The wooden frame splintered beneath the beast's weight, but it wasn't enough to kill it. Snarling, it scrambled to its feet and lunged at him again. Zora growled in frustration as he dodged its bite, the cramped quarters making his usual brute strength harder to wield. He slammed his shoulder into the wolf, pinning it against the wall, and drove his weapon down once more, the sound of bone crunching beneath his blade. Friz, backed against the hearth, unleashed a bolt of crackling magic that struck one wolf square in the chest, sending it skidding across the floor. Her hands trembled as she reached into her pocket and pulled out the wolf-shaped whistle. Desperation drove her to blow it, the mournful sound echoing through the cabin like a haunting melody. But instead of scattering, the wolves outside answered the call. Dark shapes moved in the forest, and more wolves lunged from the shadows, charging toward the already overwhelmed cabin. Thomas cursed under his breath as he dodged a snapping maw, rolling over the broken remnants of a chair. He threw out a hand, sending a burst of eldritch energy into one wolf's flank, the arcane force slamming it into a wall. The beast yelped but quickly scrambled back to its feet, eyes gleaming with renewed fury. Thomas barely had time to duck, as another wolf leapt at him, its claws tearing through the air where his head had been moments before. Thalia moved with tabaxi grace, weaving through the chaos, firing eldritch magic flashing in the dim light. She drove one forceful blast into the wolf's side before twisting to avoid another's snapping jaws. The cramped space made it hard to maneuver, and she hissed in frustration as a wolf's claws scraped across her arm. Undeterred, she spun low and slashed at the beast's legs, sending it crashing to the ground. The fight dragged on, each moment more desperate than the last. Blood splattered the cabin walls, and the air grew thick with the scent of iron and ash. The adventurers fought shoulder to shoulder, their movements frantic and uncoordinated in the narrow space. At last, with one final sweep of Zirath's axe and a blast of magic from Friz, the final wolf fell, its grotesque form crumbling into ash. Outside, the forest fell eerily silent once more. The adventurers stood panting, weapons dripping with blood, their breaths visible in the cold air. Around them, the remains of 6 massive wolves lay scattered, their bodies dissolving into blackened ash. The cabin, once a relic of forgotten peace, now stood drenched in blood and shadowed by the dark forces of the Darkwood. After the battle, the adventurers took time to secure the cabin, weighing their options. Resting there behind barricaded doors and broken windows, reinforced with splintered furniture, seemed safer than risking the open forest. As the fire crackled in the hearth, they gathered around the worn table, spreading out the map given to them by their friends from Tinborough Mining Cooperative. They plotted their next steps carefully, marking grids along the planned road and agreeing on the most efficient path to cover. Each point on the map represented another stretch of unknown danger, but the methodical approach gave them a sense of control, however fleeting. At dawn, they set out with purpose, navigating the dense Darkwood according to their plan. They followed marked sections of the road and explored each surrounding area, their eyes constantly scanning for signs of what had hunted the road crews. Their path soon led them to a sheer cliff face, a jagged expanse of rock towering high above the surrounding forest. The half-finished road had been carved around its base, but construction had stalled at the cliffside, where loose stones and crumbling earth made the route perilous. Cliffs like these were common near the mountains, natural barriers that often slowed progress, but the scale of this one made it clear why the road crews had been forced to push farther into the Darkwood. As the adventurers scouted the area, a desperate cry for help pierced the stillness. The voice was familiar, and they quickly moved toward it, their weapons drawn in case of danger. They found the retired Central City guard they had seen at the Guildhall pinned under a massive rock, the aftermath of a recent rock slide. His leg was trapped, the heavy stone pressing against his calf, leaving him pale and sweating from the effort to keep calm. A visible wave of relief washed over the trapped adventurer as he saw the party approach, his tense features softening as hope replaced the fear that had clung to him during his long, painful wait beneath the crushing weight of the stone. Zora and Zirath, both powerful warriors, immediately discussed how best to use brute strength to lift the rock. Zora paced around the boulder, muttering about angles and grip, while Zirath crossed his arms and suggested they simply lift together and be done with it. Thomas, however, leaned on a nearby tree, shaking his head with the air of someone who had seen this all before. He argued for leverage instead, pointing out that all they needed was a sturdy branch and the right pivot point. To Frizz's ears, his confident tone made it sound as though he had personally invented the concepts of engineering. Meanwhile, Frizz stood quietly to the side, watching the debate unfold with a glint of amusement in her eyes. She listened intently, nodding along as though considering each suggestion carefully. Without a word, she traced a quick arcane symbol in the air and cast a shrinking spell on the stone. The massive boulder shimmered and shrank. She walked up, and was herself able to lift it and toss it aside. Zora shot Frizz a look, his brow raised, but she only offered a serene smile, as if this had been the plan all along. With a hint of amusement, she calmly noted that in the end, their acquaintance was no longer trapped. Frizz's calm expression remained, but her eyes sparkled with suppressed laughter as she helped the guard back to his feet. Thalia joined in with a knowing smile. After patching him up, Thalia handed him a sturdy branch to use as a crutch. His grateful smile lingered a moment longer on her, his cheeks flushed despite his injury. The brief moment of tension had been noted by the party, save perhaps for Frizz. For her academic brilliance, the subtleties of implicit conversation was a blind spot. The party copied a section of their map, working out the safest and straightest path back to the city. Shaken, he explained what had led him there. He had seen the hunter scaling the cliffside with an unnerving ease that defied his years. Determined to follow, the guard had been sure he could do the same, until he slipped and brought part of the rock face down on himself. He thanked them one last time. They turned once more toward the unknown dangers deeper in the forest. After another day and a half's walk through the dense forest, the adventurers heard a second cry for help. The voice echoed through the trees, frantic and pleading, pulling them deeper into the Darkwood. As they quickened their pace, the shadows around them seemed to stretch longer and the air seemed overburdened from the damp moss and decaying leaves. Zora had recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to Dax, the rogue from the Guildhall. His heart quickened as he glanced at the others before moving ahead, his steps driven by urgency. When they found her, she appeared unharmed but trapped at the bottom of a narrow pit. Her wide eyes fixed on Zora as she called out for help, her voice trembling with desperation. Without hesitation, Zora had stepped forward to help. He leaned down, his hand extending toward her, his usual caution overridden by concern. But as he reached out, he felt nothing. The hand he gripped vanished along with the figure of Dax, and the ground beneath him shifted. With a sudden metallic clang, a massive chain net sprung from the earth, tightening around him and hauling him off the ground. The iron coils wrapped around him, leaving him suspended and struggling against the unyielding chains. From the shadows, Dax's voice carried a playful lilt as she stepped into view, her dagger twirling lazily between her fingers. She'd expressed mock regret, explaining that she hadn't meant for it to be personal, but the prize was hers. She assured him there wouldn't be any bloodshed, unless he forced her hand. None could glean where the voice was coming from. The adventurers exchanged tense glances as they reached for their weapons. It was clear now that the dangers of the Darkwood extended beyond beasts lurking in the shadows. Trickery and betrayal stalked the forest just as surely as any monster, and Zora, trapped in the net, was a reminder that even familiar and smiling faces couldn't always be trusted. The prize of 5,000 gold pieces would dull the better judgment, or at worst the mercy of most. The trap had slowed their progress. Untangling Zora from the chain net had been no easy task. The iron links were cleverly woven, designed to tighten with any movement. Each attempt to loosen the coils only made the bindings more constrictive, forcing Zirath to use brute strength to cut down the massive tree, while Frizz directed careful spells to weaken the metal. Even Thomas had begrudgingly admired the trap's design, noting that it wasn't the work of ordinary bandits. Whoever had set it knew how to ensnare even the strongest of prey. The rogue named Dax was skilled despite her youth. By the time Zora was finally freed, the light filtering through the canopy had faded, and the adventurers were acutely aware that valuable time had been lost. The adventurers were now many days beyond the last road crew marker, having exhausted every search grid between Tinborough and the forest's deeper reaches. Frustration weighed heavily on them. Each stretch of forest they scouted seemed more labyrinthian than the last. Thick roots twisted across the ground, and the canopy above grew denser, choking out the daylight. They pressed onward, driven by a growing sense that the answers they sought were just beyond the next bend, the next shadowed glade. The forest sloped ever downward, guiding them into a vast, sunken valley. Here, the air felt different, charged, as if humming with an unseen power. Moonlight pierced the canopy in thin, silvery beams, illuminating shimmering crystals that jutted from the ground like jagged teeth. The moss-covered roots around them glowed faintly, casting an otherworldly light that made the trees seem alive. Each step felt heavier, the electric energy of the valley pressing against them like an unseen force. The adventurers moved cautiously through the valley, their senses heightened by the eerie stillness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and ancient bark, and even the rustling of leaves seemed muted, as though the forest itself was listening. Then, from the distance, Zirath perceived the unmistakable sounds of a struggle. The clash of steel and the grunts of combat echoed faintly through the trees, drawing the adventurers' attention. They exchanged quick glances, tightening their grips on weapons as they followed the sound. Each step brought them closer to the source, their footsteps careful and deliberate on the uneven ground. As they approached, the sounds grew louder, blades clashing, heavy breathing, and the sharp, unmistakable growls of something inhuman. Whatever battle was taking place in the heart of the Darkwood, it wasn't over yet. The adventurers crept stealthily toward the clearing, their boots silent on the mossy forest floor as the eerie glow of the crystals grew stronger. The jagged stones jutted from the ground, their surfaces casting fractured beams of moonlight across the trees. In the center of the clearing stood the hunter, his silver and blue armor reflecting that same, the eerie luminescence. His cloak shifted with the breeze, and his sword, long, polished and deadly, caught the moonlight as if it had been forged for that very moment. The scene before them was brutal. The lifeless bodies of wolves, grotesque and massive, their fur matted with blood, were scattered like broken toys. Yet the fight was not over. One monstrous wolf remained, pacing slowly around the hunter, its burning eyes locked on him. The creature moved with unnatural grace, muscles rippling beneath its dark fur, and its growl reverberated through the clearing. The adventurers froze, watching behind cover as the hunter faced the beast alone. He stood motionless, his blade steady in his hand. When the wolf lunged, the hunter moved like the wind, a blur of steel and feral precision. His first strike was swift and deliberate, cutting deep into the wolf's flank. The creature howled in rage and twisted to strike back, but the hunter had already pivoted, dodging the snapping jaws with ease. He danced around the beast with fluid grace, each movement precise and controlled, his armor barely making a sound as he shifted through the shadows. Zora tightened his grip on his axe, awe flickering in his eyes as he watched the hunter dispatch the wolf with methodical efficiency. Friz murmured quietly to herself, taking mental notes on his fighting style while Zirath stood tense. Thalia and Thomas had the same idea, to keep their distance should things take a turn. The final blow came swift and decisive. The hunter's blade arced through the air, catching the wolf across the throat. The beast stumbled, its fiery eyes dimming as it let out a guttural snarl before collapsing in a heap. Stillness reclaimed the clearing, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The hunter straightened, sheathing his sword with practiced ease. He sniffed the air, his sharp gaze scanning the forest. Without turning his head, he spoke in a low, commanding tone that carried across the clearing. And despite their cover, he was looking in their direction when he spoke. His perception was sharp. He knew they were here. He strode toward them, his movements deliberate and calm, as if he had all the time in the world. Moonlight cast his shadow, long and foreboding, across the forest floor. His eyes, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light, locked on the adventurers as they emerged from the tree line. To a question none had asked, he answered that the twisted wolves were a product of this cove, that there was a power in the surrounding jagged crystals. They were a gift from his mother Moon, a piece of herself fallen in the time of legends. Over time they twisted one's truth form. The wolves challenged the hunter for supremacy in the Darkwood. That was the way of wolves, he said, but these lands were under his protection. He told them of his oath made long ago to protect these lands from all who sought to harm it. He had been chosen by Mother Moon herself, and for centuries he had upheld that vow. He had tried to warn them all. Some had come to take the lands before, others would continue, but this, he said, had been their lands. As Friz listened to the hunter speak, insight came to her, a heaviness beneath the command, a sorrow wrapped in his words that even centuries couldn't hide. It wasn't the tone of someone guarding a land for power or duty alone. It was personal. She glanced at the others, her mind racing as the pieces fell into place. The cabin they had found, with its beds and untouched carving, the graves behind it, tended with care, and the wolf-shaped whistle, all of it pointed to a life once lived here. This was more than territory to him. It had been his home, and those graves likely held his family. Friz couldn't help but wonder what could drive a druid to take such a sombre and unyielding oath. The Moonsingers were protectors, not isolationists. What tragedy, she thought, had broken him enough to abandon the living world and bind himself to the Darkwood for centuries? With the same calm intensity, he gave them a choice. He bade them leave now and never return. The road would not be built. He would stop all intruders from claiming the lands he was sworn to defend. The party stood frozen for a moment, uncertainty flickering in their eyes as the hunter loomed before them. But Zirath, ever the paladin of justice and resolve, didn't wait. He surged forward, his battle-axe gleaming as he raised it with unwavering purpose. The hunter's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a snarl that reverberated through the forest like distant thunder. Then, without warning, the hunter transformed. The shift was instantaneous. His form twisted and expanded, silver armor splitting and falling away as fur erupted across his body. What stood before them now wasn't a man. It was the Alpha, a massive, hulking beast of fur, muscle, and fury. Towering over the adventurers, he radiated primal power, his glowing eyes burning with ancient rage. Where the other wolves had been monstrous, this creature was a true king of the forest, a living nightmare brought to life. The battle erupted into chaos as Zirath charged head-on, his battle-axe aimed for the beast's chest. The Alpha met him with a swipe of its massive claws, the blow sending Zirath staggering backward, his scales screeching as the razor-sharp claws carved into his armor. Thomas and Thalia, keeping their distance, fired blast after blast of eldritch energy, each crack of magic illuminating the forest in brief flashes. The Alpha twisted and moved with unnatural speed, leaping across the battlefield in a blur, closing the gap between him and the casters in an instant. Thomas barely dodged the beast's claws, diving behind a twisted root as the Alpha's massive paw struck where he'd been standing. Thalia let out a series of rapid-fire blasts, her hands steady and her expression grim. Each strike aimed at the beast's glowing eyes. But the Alpha was relentless, closing the distance faster than they could retreat, his sheer speed turning the battlefield into a blur of movement and violence. Zora planted his feet, sword raised as the Alpha barreled toward him. The blade met the beast mid-lunge, cutting deep into fur and muscle, but even Zora's strength wasn't enough to stop the creature's momentum. The Alpha crashed into him with the force of a battering ram, knocking him flat. Zora hit the ground hard, his sword clattering from his grasp as he groaned, forcing himself to roll to his side and scramble back to his feet before the creature could strike again. Frizz, seeing her companions battered and bloodied, drew on her deepest reserves of magic. They weren't in the cramped confines of the cabin anymore. There was no fear of starting an inferno in the open forest. She let loose a fireball with a sharp twist of her fingers, the blazing orb streaking toward the Alpha. It hit the creature square in the side, exploding in a torrent of flame that sent embers and smoke billowing into the night. The Alpha howled in rage, twisting to face Frizz, but she didn't stop. With a shout, she unleashed another fireball, the forest lighting up with the brilliant fleeting glow of her magical onslaught. The legendary beast reared back and howled into the night, a bone-chilling sound that reverberated through the Darkwood. The trees seemed to tremble at the sound, and from the shadows emerged two more twisted wolves, their grotesque forms larger and more warped than the ones they had faced before. It was clear that the Alpha in his mighty form could summon and control them. The new beasts growled low, their eyes burning with the same fury as in the cabin, and without hesitation, they lunged into the fray. The adventurers tightened their formation, their breaths ragged and their movements growing slower with each passing moment. Wounds stained their armor and clothes with blood, the scent of iron mixing with the thick, damp air. Zirath hefted his battle-axe, cutting down one of the twisted wolves as it tried to leap at Thomas. But the effort left him vulnerable. The remaining wolf barreled into him, knocking him to the ground, claws scraping across his scales as he wrestled to keep its jaws away from his neck. Zora, bruised and bleeding, stood back to back with Thalia, his sword carving through the second wolf. Thalia, her daggers flashing in the faint moonlight, struck with precision, driving one blade deep into the creature's flank. It snarled in pain, but even wounded, it fought with relentless ferocity. Thomas, from a safer distance, hurled bolts of eldritch energy, each blast burning through fur and flesh. But the creatures seemed almost impervious to pain, driven by the Alpha's command. The Alpha himself was relentless, towering over them all, his claws tearing through armor and flesh alike. His movements, fast and brutal, left the adventurers staggering with every strike. Frizz, sweat beading on her brow, summoned fire and force, desperate to turn the tide. But the battle dragged on, and exhaustion was creeping in. Everyone was wounded, blood staining the forest floor beneath them. It wasn't until Frizz gathered every ounce of arcane power she had left that the tide finally turned. With a sharp incantation, she unleashed a final blast of pure magical energy, a concentrated force that crackled with fire and light. The blast struck the Alpha square in the chest, the sheer impact staggering the beast. His glowing eyes flickered, his monstrous form trembling as he let out one last guttural snarl. As the towering beast fell, a heavy silence descended on the forest. The adventurers, battered and bloodied, stood over the crumpled form of the Alpha, their weapons still drawn, breaths coming in ragged gasps. Slowly before their eyes, the monstrous creature began to shift. Fur receded, claws retracted, and what remained was the hunter, human once more, though his body lay broken and gravely wounded on the forest floor. As the towering beast fell, a heavy silence descended on the forest. The adventurers, battered and bloodied, stood over the crumpled form of the Alpha, their weapons still drawn, breaths coming in ragged gasps. Slowly before their eyes, the monstrous creature began to shift. Fur receded, claws retracted, and what remained was the hunter, human once more, though his body lay broken and gravely wounded on the forest floor. The hunter's chest rose and fell in deep laboured breaths as Zirath approached, his battle-axe still clenched tightly in his hands. The dragonborn moved with deliberate caution, his eyes locked on the fallen man, his every step echoing with the weight of justice. As Zirath raised his axe, the hunter's gaze lifted to meet his, a flicker of recognition crossing his battered face. There was a pause. The party had never seen Zirath paused. The hunter's voice, weak but steady, broke the stillness. He told Zirath of the oath he had sworn to Mother Moon, one that had once filled him with purpose but had over time consumed him with rage. His vow to protect the Darkwood had left him lost, with no clear path forward. What he sought to defend had long since slipped beyond his grasp, leaving him with nothing but fury and instinct. Zirath lowered his axe slightly, listening intently as the hunter's words echoed in his mind. His words seemed to reach Zirath. Both protectors, both bound by duty to something greater than themselves. It wasn't an enemy that lay before Zirath now, but a man broken by his own promise. An oath of vengeance twisted like the trees and wolves of the forest. As the hunter spoke, the crystals scattered throughout the clearing began to glow. Their faint shimmer grew stronger, each jagged surface absorbing the moonlight filtering through the canopy. The adventurers glanced nervously at one another as the pulsing light grew brighter, dancing across the moss-covered ground like rippling water. Zirath did not break his focus. The hunter's lips curled into a knowing smile. His gaze lingered on Zirath before shifting toward the crystals. In his final moments, he offered them a parting gift from Mother Moon. His voice, though soft, carried a strange peace. He spoke of purpose, of clarity. The surrounding light burned intensely now, casting the clearing in brilliant silver hues, bending and twisting around the adventurers and the dying hunter. The party braced instinctively, weapons raised and spells at the ready, as a surge of energy erupted from the crystals. The pulse of light struck with the force of a thunderclap, knocking each of them backward. They hit the ground hard, the world spinning as the clearing filled with blinding silver light. When the light faded and the adventurers slowly came to, they found themselves alone. Both the hunter and Zirath were gone, vanished without a trace. Only the shattered crystals remained, their glow extinguished, leaving only dead silence in the heart of the Darkwood. We end our tale today with the mysterious disappearance of Zirath. Until next time, fellow adventurers.